Certainly there's a lot of uncertainty looking into the future of transportation technologies, particularly around autonomous vehicles. And as public transit agencies look into that future, uncertainty certainly seems to be the word. Lots of sort of daunting questions, right, that driverless technologies pose. Namely, is transit going to be obsolete, right? Are mobility options going to be increasingly privatized as the new technologies are more broadly adopted? Should public transportation agencies stop investing entirely as driverless sort of subsumes demand for public transit? From my view as a journalist, it seems like if there are sort of any answers, it's that transit agencies and city planners together need to be able to articulate pretty strong and even courageous visions for what that future looks like if transit is sort of able to avoid a descent into irrelevancy, right? This is sort of the narrative out there. What that future should look like and how to get there are certainly open-ended questions that cities around the country and the world are sort of forging their way to answering, including right here in Portland, which is certainly regarded as a leader in this regard. We know change is coming, right? So sort of what are the possible outcomes? And that's what we're going to be kind of discussing today. And just to sort of go over again, right, as the folks earlier this morning have laid out, we know the opportunities are really big, and I think that is also the case for public transit agencies, right? There's a chance to sort of correct the mistakes that were made during the age of the automobile, when cities were carved up to make way for cars and highways. We're going to potentially reprioritize lanes and curb space, right? Eliminate traffic deaths, reduce pollution, and personal vehicle ownership. These are certainly goals that transit agencies share, right, and I think are working towards no matter what. But we know too, as Susan just so eloquently laid out, the risk potentials are super high, and especially if we're looking at the kind of net effects as we know them of transportation network companies. If we look at those as sort of precursors to the effects of autonomous vehicles on transit agencies, there are some pretty worrying impacts ahead, right? Riders decreasing, revenues falling, equity imbalances, right, writ large. So we're going to be looking at these questions, right? Is the sort of gap between what transit agencies, environmentalist city planners want and what Americans seem to want, right, which is, convenient, affordable, accessible, and cheap transportation, right? Are these sort of goals too sort of far apart to bridge? So to kick it off, I'm going to turn to Matthew here from APTA and ask, should transit agencies be panicking?
Thanks. I don't think that they should be panicking, but as some other people have said, we have to think about how we can make sure that public spaces are used for public good. Transit right now is sort of the most efficient way that we're moving people in cities, and I think it will continue to be as long as we make sure that we can keep that we can price these other options and regulate these other options and give transit the priority that it needs to continue to be the most efficient way to get people around. And so that involves, partnering with, in places where the transit agency doesn't have the sort of ability to directly influence its own streets and things like that, partnering with cities, working with cities to make sure that cities are prioritizing transit to make sure that we're moving people efficiently. I think it's no coincidence that the places that are doing really well in sort of prioritizing transit are those places where the transit agency also controls the streets, places like San Francisco. They're doing a lot of putting in red lanes, things like that to prioritize transit so that transit is the most efficient mode gets the most priority.
Right, and I might have sort of hit on the basic points, but from APTA's point of view, worst case scenario future outcome for transit agencies?
The worst case scenario is if we don't do anything to try and make sure that that these new technologies are sort of reined in, that we're going to have more congestion. We're going to have everybody who sort of has the ability to pay their way for more private modes is going to sort of leave transit, and I think it could be a pretty bad scenario. I think Susan kind of outlined that as well, like a lot more VMT, a lot more congestion on streets. If things don't go electric, then we could have a lot more pollution in cities, not just sort of greenhouse gases, but also emissions problems for people who live in cities, things like that. So it could be pretty bad, but there is hope there that we can fix things.
And to counter this, like Sharon, you're really good at this, right? Like, what is the sort of best, most synergistic, happy outcome we can imagine where transit agencies are, coexisting and even thriving in an ecosystem with on-demand transportation, including autonomous vehicles?
Okay. Well, I am kind of an eternal optimist on this subject. The Shared Use Mobility Center, we are a nonprofit. We work in the public interest, and our vision is shared mobility for all, and we see transit as the backbone with this ecosystem of choices. So that support that. And I think, like Matthew was talking about, certainly for moving large groups of people at once on fixed rail from point A to point B, there's nothing that beats transit, for its efficiency, and that has a clear future. The way we're looking at public transit, though, is that really transit agencies need to evolve to become conveners and brokers in this transit space, so that we can bring an ecosystem of choices that can be under that umbrella that includes both the transit agency and the city and other agencies, and that we're not as specific on the mode, but what we're looking at is how do we move people most efficiently. And that, I think, also requires changing the metrics, because one of the fears, which I'm sure the transit agencies on this panel will talk about, is that everybody's concerned that what are called the choice riders are moving to TNCs or other modes, and then they're going to lose their funding. And that's certainly a valid and important concern. So it's really, how do we create the system then that we can incorporate the most efficient ways for people to get to where they need to go, and make that the public system that is managing that.
Great. And just to kind of stick with you for a moment, because Shared Use Mobility Center is, I think, really well positioned to sort of know about the whole kind of landscape out there. Like, what are some of the most what are the pilots and partnerships happening right now that to you are the most kind of promising signs of this happy outcome?
Yes. Well, we work very closely with the Federal Transit Administration, operating what is called the Innovation Knowledge Accelerator, and we're working with 11 different cities around the country, including LA and Portland, on shared mobility pilot projects. So they're projects that involve a transit agency plus a shared mobility provider. And we're seeing, not only through the FTA project, but we've tracked about 50 of these going on around the country in different cities. Some of the most promising ones, I think, are the first last mile type projects. There are also a number of app integration projects where putting all these different modes together in one platform, and sort of the ultimate goal of many of those is that you can actually also have the fare collection, the real-time information, the whole kind of package put together so that you can move from mode to mode easily. And one of the interesting projects also in that is a statewide project in the state of Vermont, where they're actually, it is an app integration, but it's also an integration of all the services throughout the entire state. So it's the medical rides, it's the non-medical rides, it's like the social services that are providing transportation, as well as all the private providers and transit agencies that operate in small communities, and kind of weaving that together so that it's one system that can really function well.
Great. Didn't know about the Vermont project. That's really cool to hear about. I want to kind of take it to the transit agency view of things and turn to Josh first. He's from LA, as am I. And actually first, I mean, so, you know, the previous presenters have spoken to the sort of, you know, range of studies out there that are looking at the impacts of Uber and Lyft and other kinds of transportation network companies, and thinking about those as sort of a table setter for AV impacts. And just like, first of all, like what are you observing on the ground in LA County as far as the impacts of those services go?
Well, actually, there's some evidence that the TNCs are taking some riders away, but it's limited. And in fact, a lot of the ridership drop that we're seeing in LA County is more attributable, according to a recent study from UCLA, from the fact that people are buying more cars, which of course flies in the face of the entire thesis of a lot of what's going on here, which would be that, you know, people are going to buy fewer cars because AVs and because of TNCs. So neither of those things are happening in Los Angeles, where in the last decade we added 2.1 million cars and only 2.3 million people. So a lot more cars than we can handle. If that's the case, then I think whether it's AV or any other technology, the fact is that more and more people are choosing to use a mode, namely single occupancy vehicle use, that does not work for our metropolitan region, or really for any metropolitan region on a mass scale. And the only way that we can change that is to think about our purpose differently. And this gets to, I think, exactly what Sharon was saying, which is, what is the goal that we're trying to achieve? Is our goal to increase the number of people riding public transportation? I think that's the traditional goal of transit agencies, but I don't think it's a very good one, because in the end, our goal should be, we're getting taxes to accomplish this purpose, is to improve mobility for everybody, right? That's the goal. And you can do that in part by increasing transit ridership, but that's not the only way to do that. The more people walk, the more people bike, the more people use shared vehicles, the greater mobility can occur. So part of it is setting the right metric, and that's something we're doing right now with the development of our strategic plan, which you'll be able to see in the next month or so.
Great. I mean, so one thing I hope to hear from you about next is like from the thinking about all the impacts, right? Like very nuts and bolts. Financially, autonomous vehicles present a challenge for transit agencies. The sort of new services do as well. I mean, apart from the question of drawing riders, well, yeah, that's sort of inevitably interwoven. I wonder if you can kind of speak to LA Metro has certainly been the object of a lot of attention for its recent request for proposal for a new microtransit service, right? That I think sort of speaks directly to the goal that you're starting to articulate. I wonder if you can kind of talk about that and maybe weave in a bit how the agency is thinking about its financial future in providing these kinds of new services and options.
Well, I'm limited in how much I can talk about the microtransit project because we're currently in the blackout period. But I can tell you what the thinking is behind the project, which is that most of our riders are on buses. Most of those buses are coming with service that is not particularly frequent. We're talking about 20 or 30 minutes. And most people have to transfer 1 or 2 or 3 times. So when that is your transportation option, and in LA it's typically the transportation option of last resort, because anyone who can't afford a car will try to buy one, then you're typically taking multiple buses, multiple wait times to go any significant distance. That adds a tremendous challenge to accessing opportunities and jobs in Los Angeles. So what we're going to experiment with is, well, what if we provided some kind of on-demand service that would be shared, that would allow you to travel point to point, and would cut down on all that transferring and all that waiting, and give people greater certainty and a better user experience? Would that save our customers time in getting from place to place, and potentially bring in new customers who otherwise would have stuck to driving or some other means of transportation? The thinking there is that the alternatives have improved, and we haven't, right? TNCs, even though they're vastly underpricing themselves and I don't think are sustainable in current form, they are offering a service that is much, much better than what we offer. So if we're going to compete with what user expectations are becoming, we have to try to offer something similar that will enable people to get where they're going faster. Again, I didn't say that we're going to try to increase ridership. It's not necessarily about that. It's about providing an opportunity for all the population, not just those who can use TNCs, because as Susan said, not everybody can use them, but for all the population to use an on-demand travel mode that is sustainable and equitable.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, it's just what Josh was just saying was exactly what our research showed in a recent study we did for the Transportation Research Board. And we were looking at TNC use and transit use, and there was a survey, and there was also origin and destination data actually from one of the TNCs. And in LA, you know, what we saw was that that in fact people use the TNCs when I mean, it's not really surprising. It's when, you know, that they use it when it's more convenient, right? So you can get somewhere faster with that than on the transit system. So it's those rides that are multiple transfers, infrequent. That's when you see that. And in cities that are more auto-oriented, like LA and Nashville was the other city we were looking at that was more auto-oriented, the TNC use is actually heaviest at nights and on weekends, and it's people going, but it is going from single occupancy vehicles primarily to using the TNCs. So it's not for everyone, but it does you know, add a convenience level. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on the equity points. What is happening in LA is really interesting. I think I covered the study that you were referencing there, and a large portion of the increase in car ownership is, you know, households that had been lower income, right, and not able to afford cars, now being able to, right, and sort of very understandably wanting to get around LA like, you know, most folks who choose to get around LA do, which is to say by car. I want to turn to Alan, our local representative here in Portland, who works with TriMet, to kind of keep going with this equity frame. What are you observing on the ground in Portland as far as some of the newer mobility services, and what do you anticipate with AVs sort of looking through that equity lens?
Yeah. So equity considerations here, very important, obviously. We kind of think of ourselves, our vision at TriMet is to do our part to make this the best place to live in the country. Our part, we're just a transit agency, we can't do everything. We think of ourselves as having 4 roles: providing, fighting against congestion, getting people to jobs and businesses, fulfilling the social contract, so providing mobility for people who don't have a lot of other options, and then helping support the growth and the way that the development happens in the region. And the most productive, most cost-effective services we have are the frequent services that provide all 4, right? The risk of AV is that it starts to peel away the folks who are making those trips that have the most resources, that have the most opportunity to have other choices. The ones that we are most likely to lose to driving on their own or getting in a relatively expensive car that's only carrying 1 or 2 people. And anytime, so much of that is kind of bound up in the profit motive. Anytime the profit motive is really driving services and what people are able to do, you have a fundamental equity concern. This is why the policy, this is why these kinds of conversations are so important right now. And so the risk is to a transit agency, to us, that you start peeling away some of those other uses, and therefore some of the ridership, our productivity goes down, we carry fewer people per hour, per dollar, and we can provide even less service to those who have the fewest other choices. So when we think about both the risk and the promise of these opportunities in the future, we're looking for ways to supplement and complement our service, but still doubling down on the fact that transit, we don't use this term much anymore, but mass transit, getting that many people in a vehicle is a really smart thing to do in a city. Being able to move them along a corridor where they can meet lots of needs and lots of different people can all ride in the same vehicle together is a really smart thing to do. Any technology that pushes against that is a risk to the civic structure, to our very society in some ways, but it's also an opportunity when we start thinking about, okay, what about the branches? How do you get folks from the edges to the system in a way that's cost effective, that doesn't drain the resources from the center and from those main corridors throughout the region in all the suburbs where we have frequent service, high ridership service.
So how? Yeah.
Well, we are probably not the leading or bleeding edge on this. We're still figuring it out. I think we all are. A lot of it has to do with thinking about how we can use this technology through partnerships in the near term to complement transit service. And then in the long term, if we get to the point where the AV technology is really makes sense for larger vehicles, eventually it becomes a challenge to transit as to whether our own directly operated vehicles are driven not by an operator, but by the system.
I want to pick up on one thing that Jeff mentioned in his presentation earlier, is the sort of the first mile, last mile connection potential, right? Whether it's TNCs or autonomous vehicles, serving as a sort of crucial connections between further flung communities and transit connections leading to jobs. And he connected that very rightly to poverty, right? The suburbanization of poverty and lower income communities increasingly living further from jobs. So I think this is a really important sort of frame, right, to think about this first mile, last mile question. When, I don't know, like what is sort of the best evidence out there, Matt, that points to these services actually functioning in that capacity?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't a ton of examples of places that are really putting this into use so far, but there's a lot of discussion about the use cases of, like, if you have something like the more high capacity fast transit that provides time savings, then you can use those sort of first mile, last mile solutions to connect people in suburban areas to them, and then you can you don't, like Jeff was talking about, you don't have to have as much parking around your stations, things like that, and then you can, build housing or whatever and generate even more sort of even more of that compact development that encourages bike, walk, transit, things like that. So there's that sort of use case for, in talking about the sort of suburbanization of poverty thing, there are people talking about, well, what can we do? We have these sort of like infrequent services right now in suburban areas. What can we do to sort of, is there an opportunity for those on-demand services to provide more efficient service? And if so, then how do you sort of chain those together so that people are making shared trips as part of them? Because right now, even if you have infrequent service, you're bringing people together because you have your service runs on a schedule, right? So everyone who wants to use it knows that the bus comes at 8:30 and they can catch it. But if you're switching to on-demand service, how do you let people know that other people want to ride at this time too, and then you can serve all those trips at the same time rather than, you know, dispatching one vehicle for each person, which is just not as efficient.
Yeah. Well, you were probably going to answer that, but I'll just, you know, I think that part of the technology of the on-demand services provides that opportunity because you can make a reservation, in fact, for your trip, and then there are algorithms that are used for the routing, and there are a number of companies out there that are doing that kind of thing. And I was also going to mention one of the pilots through these FTA projects is in San Francisco with a company called Scoop, which is about carpooling to the BART station. So it's kind of a simple, it's not a mass transit to the station, but it's an interesting first last mile because what it does is it provides priority parking and it provides actually parking at all because those stations are parked up early. And so people who come in this kind of electronically arranged carpool then, you know, have access to the BART. And it's a trip that you're booking, you know, you're going on the BART as part of the whole process.
I was actually going to make a slightly different point, which is alludes to something that Jeff said in his talk. Ultimately, what we're talking about when it comes to solving this challenge is a competition for right-of-way. And all these things that were, you know, the ability to use technology to create on-demand, that's wonderful, but the biggest battles are being fought right now in Los Angeles by us as we try to secure right-of-way for the next $120 billion worth of investment that we're making in mass transit. That's underground, that's above ground, that's bus lanes, that's everywhere. And really, when you think about the trade-offs and the cost-benefit, that's where the battle is being fought over whether we're using that right-of-way for vehicles carrying large numbers of people or whether we're using it for vehicles carrying one person. And that's really where the critical issue is.
I mean, say more about that. Is it another question I hope to pose to you at some point is about planning for not only you know, buses and trains and microtransit, but also walking and cycling infrastructure, right? When we're talking about right-of-way, that's a super important consideration too. So how do you sort of weigh all of these factors?
Yeah, I mean, all of those are critical. Biking and walking have the advantage of not taking up nearly as much space as mass transit and personal vehicles, so they are actually easier to accommodate in theory. We, of course, are not an agency that controls the streets of the 88 cities within LA County. What we are able to control is the funding and the building and operation of mass transit, and that's why we're focused on the rights of way for mass transit vehicles. But absolutely, I agree that part of figuring this out is figuring out how to make sure that the right of way for pedestrians and cyclists is safe and pleasant as well.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that is about, you know, changing the mentality. I think you know, we've talked about changing this sort of auto-oriented mentality. For so long, the mentality of people, you know, in charge of highway departments, street departments, et cetera, has been a vehicle is a vehicle is a vehicle. And so one car with one person in it is the same as people carpooling, is the same as a bus with 40 people on it. And so part of that is having our transit agencies and advocates change the mentality to say, like, look, you have to be counting how many people are coming through on these things so that, you know, we can properly allocate all this right away to say we're going to move as many people as possible down this street, not as many vehicles as possible down the street.
Right, and that ties in very much with congestion pricing and the potential to value shared vehicles and, you know, certainly larger shared vehicles, you know, and value that more than the single occupancy vehicle. and price it accordingly to allocate the space. And also, just to mention on the biking and walking, I think one of the things that's really great about this conference is that you are addressing not just mobility, but thinking about land use and health and the economy. And certainly when we think about how to value biking and walking and the health benefits of allowing for that, and also the social interaction to think about all of these modes, I mean, it's a really critical component in how we value it. And it really, I think all of this speaks to this need for a lot better coordination and bringing people together from different agencies, because often these things are handled in such siloed ways that, you know, there's the bike place that's with the city DOT, and then there's the transit that's with the transit agency, and maybe there's a little bit of transit that's actually with the city, and there's the regulatory place that's where the TNCs and taxis. So it's, you know, part of the change we need is to get that coordination, as well as then bringing the private companies into the fold.
Great. And I want to just turn one more time to Alan to speak to the question of labor. I think Jeff described this question of the effects of automation on, you know, transit as a potential disaster from a labor perspective, and, you know, sort of called for more involvement on the part of labor organizers and unions. But I wonder if this is, you know, what kind of nuance you can bring to that from a local perspective here in Portland, where I think I've read there's actually a shortage right now of bus operators, right? So wondering how you can if you can kind of connect the contours of the labor transit landscape to what's ahead.
I'll try a little bit. There's only so much I can say without our ATU friends up here as well. But we have been having trouble getting operators here. It takes a long time to find somebody who is, you know, ready, willing, able to do that, and especially when the economy is great, there are lots of other options out there. That won't be true forever, but it's true right now. You know, the growth and the evolution of AV technology is going to be more, I think, about how does what the products that we're able to provide that provides for benefits to the region and to the communities, how those meet our vision and our roles is ultimately going to then come out down the line. What are the kinds of jobs that we have available? So, you know, someday maybe not every vehicle has to have an operator, but most vehicles have somebody on there who's looking out for the needs of our customers. So the roles might change. But is it, you know, a driver this year for us thinking about how we deal with that? No, it's more about the long-term kind of evolution of it. And then at the edges, when we're talking about last mile connections, you know, if I have to be cost effective, put 15 or more people per hour boarding a bus to be able to make up for what we're paying our employees to be good stewards of their time and their needs. The only way to get some of these really dispersed areas to have connections to the transit agency is to look for partnerships and cheaper ways to do that. And so AV technology on the fringes has a near-term potential. In the long run, I think it's very much a conversation.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you that our experience with labor has been, to this point, quite positive because we have framed the problem as one that we're all in together, right? I mean, we're losing riders, and they stand to lose as much from that as we do, not more. So the two projects we have going on, one which should be Sharon's favorite project is our Mobility on Demand project, where we're working with the TNC to provide first last mile connections, and then our microtransit project I talked about earlier. We've brought labor along on those projects by saying, look, let's work together to solve this problem. You're part of the solution as well, and so far we've been successful.
Great. I wanted to save a couple minutes at the end to open it up to questions from the audience. So I'll just look for hands if anyone wants to raise one. Yeah.
I'll try and use my outdoor Jerry, Terry, Perkins, and Will. You kind of touched upon the need to get out of silos. You're kind of looking at this from the point of view of transit operators, research people, and Sharon, you're looking at kind of shared mobility. But really, the problem, as Jeff has identified, is a lot more holistic. At what point, and who is the person that kind of almost demands this, that each of your departments or whatever get out of their silos and start cooperating and working across a single platform for every city or for every state? Is it the LA DOT? Is it California DOT? Is it Oregon DOT? PBOT? What? If you could just talk about that.
From my perspective, I don't know that it's DOT. I think that TriMet and Metro, some of the folks in the room, and the city of Portland have a strong role in that. A number of those conversations are happening, but we need to do more, I'm sure.
And just to restate for anybody who didn't hear in the back, the question was who's sort of mandating that different agencies and organizations get out of their silos in working on these issues?
Yeah, and in California, I think the county agencies are actually in a great position to do that. LA Metro, and we're not alone in this, is a multimodal agency that has the ability to work across a number of those silos. We're talked about as a transit agency, but as I said, we're a mobility agency, and the reason that we're a mobility agency is that we do a lot of things that are not traditional public transit, including operate the express lanes, which are congestion toll lanes in LA County that are going to be expanding dramatically over the next 10 years. We operate the bike share system in LA County, and we are playing a role in funding all the 88 cities in LA County and what they're doing with their transportation investments. So I think that a lot of county organizations in Los Angeles are positioned to effectively work on mobility across silos. That is not the case in most of the rest of the country. In my previous job at the Eno Center for Transportation, we did a study on transit governance and looked at how most transit agencies structure their governance, and it's not a way that is conducive to holistic operation, and it is a huge challenge, and changing those governance structures is very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to add that California, there's some really great models of how things are coming together, but one of the trends we are noticing across the country, though, is agencies hiring mobility managers and actually thinking about the variety of shared mobility, whether it's car sharing or bike sharing, and then coordinating with the transit agency. And so that is coming up more and more. The Twin Cities is looking for somebody right now for that kind of position.
Job opportunity. We actually have to wrap it up there, keep stuff moving along, but just give a round of applause for the panelists.